Ladies and gentlemen, I was born in Brussels, in one of the 19 communes that form the Brussels region, to parents who migrated from a small Flemish village 35 kilometers away from the capital. It was a cultural shock for them at the time, the transition from the countryside to the big city. I myself have no memory of it, because 2 years after my birth we moved to the outskirts of Brussels, where I still live 71 years later. I got to know Brussels very well from 1957, when I started going to a Jesuit school in the heart of the city in the Marolles. Every day I was on the road twice for 50 minutes. The tram took me along the Royal Palace, the churches of St. James on the Coudenberg, the Church of the Sablons, and the Chapel Church of the 13th century. From quite close we saw the impressive Palace of Justice every day. As a child I already had the impression of making a daily tourist trip through historic Brussels. Brussels has become my city, although I have never lived there except briefly for 2 months in the Prime Minister's residence in 2009. However, I have worked there throughout my career, in all kinds of positions, national and European. I worked in 5 buildings in the most famous street among them. 16 Rue de la Loi, home to the Belgian Prime Minister, and 175 Rue de la Loi, home to the European Council. French President Sarkozy used as one of the arguments to convince me to become President of the European Council that I could continue to live in my city. I saw myself changing during all those years, but Brussels changed even more. At the end of the 50s, non-Belgians made up only a few percent of the population, which by then had reached 1 million. During the 60s, the first guest workers arrived, then mainly people from North Africa. Our tram drivers increasingly became foreigners, typically in low-paid jobs. The internationalization of Brussels, including in terms of population, increased in a more invisible way with the development of European administrations from 1958 onwards. Until then, Brussels had been a Belgian city, not a metropolis like the port city of Antwerp. This double migration movement changed the city. For Flemish people, Brussels had for decades become a region where they had become a small minority. Flemish politicians outside Brussels were increasingly hostile towards Brussels, and French-speaking Brussels residents felt the political pressure never to change the boundaries of the 19 communes. The massive Flemish marches on Brussels of the early 60s brought the language issue within Brussels into the heart of local and national politics. Brussels became a stumbling block in political Belgium. Things only calmed down in 1979 when the Brussels region came into being, which is own government and directly elected parliament. It is governed jointly by Francophones and Flemish people now. In the meantime, however, a demographic revolution took place. The result is that today 3/4 of the inhabitants have a migrant background, consisting of both EU and non-EU citizens, and tens of thousands of whom acquired Belgian nationality at the beginning of this century. The latter group increasingly participated in political life as voters and elected officials. For the natives, a new city was born under their watch. As a result, some moved to the periphery, where the French-speaking presence grew and caused political tensions. A large part of the Belgians remained in the region, but lived increasingly separated geographically from their non-EU fellow citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, while the Belgians were busy with their own problems, the international status of Brussels changed. In 1957, the Val-Duchesse Agreement was reached in Brussels among representatives of 6 countries on the creation of a European Economic Community enshrined in the Treaty of Rome. The Belgian Foreign Minister Paul-Henri Spaak was the spiritual and political father. On January 1st, 1958, the European Economic Community started. The European Commission built up its own administration, which today, together with that of other institutions, numbers almost 50,000 civil servants. It also has thousands of lobbyists and the largest concentration of press and media in Europe. Brussels became the seat of the community, the de facto capital of Europe. Even when the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe joined in 2004, Western European Brussels remained the capital. Brussels became more than a city. It became a concept. Sometimes it was despised as the source of bureaucracy and rules. Sometimes it was referred to as the place where history was written. The concentration of power at European level became even clearer when gradually, from 1985 onwards, the European Parliament avoided Strasbourg as much as possible and moved to Brussels for most of the meetings. The European Council has been meeting mostly in Brussels since 2002 after the Treaty of Nice. And during my presidency of the European Council between 2009 and 2014, we always met in Brussels. Brussels is the place to be for all those dealing with the European Union. In 2014, when the Union was asked to host the G7 summit, Brussels was the obvious location and the Council building the place of the event. But Brussels stretched its wings even further. When President de Gaulle's France left the military part of NATO in 1966, its headquarters moved to Evere, one of the 19 municipalities of Brussels. That organization too, the largest military alliance in the world, brought thousands of civil servants and military personnel to the country. The inhabitants of Brussels still do not fully realize the influence that their region has in the world. Economically, this international role brought a lot of activity to the region and to the 2 provinces of Brabant. The GDP per capita of these regions became the highest in the country. However, the inhabitants of Brussels themselves saw their income per capita fall in comparison to the national average. The employment rate of people with a non-EU background is one of the lowest in Western Europe. The inequalities in the region had increased very rapidly. The reputation of Brussels was felt differently by many who lived there. Brussels as a place of contradictions, Brussels as a place of paradoxes. Despite all these changes, Brussels has remained a large provincial city, relatively small compared to other capitals and above all unpretentious, with a lot of green, especially through the Forêt de Soignes, and with a large cultural offering. In this sense, despite the great changes, it has remained my Brussels. And yet, it has become one of the most important cities in the world.